Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here, tradeathletics.com. Today I want to do another breakdown. Here we're going to be looking at Brusdar Graterol. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's pretty relevant right now in the playoffs. All of us are kind of familiar with his stuff, throwing a bowling ball sinker, 100 miles an hour. Pretty crazy, but I just want to go over some quick facts first, kind of break down his mechanics, pinpoint a couple of the things that he's doing so well, just to give you a kind of a taste of his mechanical efficiency, and then pinpoint a couple of things that I think if you have similar mechanics, similar movement patterns to him, could maybe be cleaned up a little bit. Not that he needs to change any of this stuff, but again, just so that you guys can learn from what he is doing very efficiently and maybe what could be a little bit better, just from a general mechanical efficiency standpoint. So let's get into it. Some quick facts about Graterol. He's listed at 6'1", 265, so not a small guy. He's definitely a very elite athlete. He's able to produce a lot of that velocity from his arm, despite having very efficient patterns. Very good athlete, strong guy, big guy. So that's the first thing. He's only 22 years old. He debuted last year, last September. So he hasn't been around too long. Again, pretty solid athlete all around. His pitch usage, he's pretty much coming at you with sinkers and sliders. He's got a four seam, but he barely throws it. So he's sitting at about 67% sinkers and 29% sliders. Obviously, average velocity, 99 miles an hour. We're all familiar. We've all seen the pitching ninja gifs of this guy. But just down here in the right, pretty crazy movement, and you're able to see right there why he's so effective. He's got 15.75 inches of horizontal movement on average and 7.27 inches of vertical movement on average. So that's how he's able to create such crazy sink and ride, or sink and run on that sinker. So just kind of a look, some quick facts, but I want to get into kind of his mechanical efficiency. What does he do to allow him to throw 99 miles an hour? Yes, there's a genetic component, obviously he's a great athlete, but you can't just be a great athlete and move like crap and throw 100 miles an hour. So he's doing some things very, very well, and I want to make sure to highlight those. So again, if you guys have been watching all these breakdowns, you're going to start to see the patterns, the similarities between a lot of these hard throwers. There's not an infinite number of ways to really organize yourself to throw 100 miles an hour. There's going to be commonalities between these hard throwers as they hone in on what are the most efficient ways for a human body to produce efficient rotation. And so again, one of the things we talk about all the time is the drift. It's that forward move, that forward shifting of mass during the initial leg lift. And so we can kind of see that in this top left clip right here. It's a really good example of the drift. And again, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, basically we're looking at the center of mass, which we can approximate with his belly button. And rather than a traditional balance point, which you're just lifting your leg and your center of mass doesn't change at all, right? Your center of mass is your belly button here. It's still your belly button here. Your leg lift didn't do anything to actually get your center of mass moving forward. Let's look what happens during his leg lift. So at peak leg lift, he's shifted his center from here to there. So, roughly 4, 5, 6 inches. It's not a huge aggressive fall towards the target. It's just that subtle lean and shift that it gets the train moving, it gets the center shifted, and it sets him up to be able to effectively drop into the back glute on the next move. So just really effective initial move that he's got there. I do want to point out that he pairs this with a little bit of a posterior pelvic tilt. This is something I've talked about in other videos, but it's not just a forward move. A lot of guys, they get the forward move, but they kind of add a little bit of a coil and a tilt to their pelvis to preload that lower half. And so he gets to that peak leg lift, and what he's doing is he's posteriorly tilting the pelvis, which is basically tucking your butt underneath you during the leg lift. Right, he's in this position right here. The pelvis is posteriorly tilting, and it's coiling over the back hip. It's not just a lift. He's tilting, coiling, and that's setting him up to be able to drop into the back hip and unwind that energy. So just an interesting look from a couple different angles at that initial move. From there, we could talk about his linear move. Now, what's interesting about his linear move towards the target is that he's got a very internal rotation dominant lower half. And what I mean by that is the positions that he gets into as he actually gets into the hinge. So we can think about the lower half in terms of 3 phases, right? There's the drift, which is basically from here to here, that's phase number 1. There's the hinge or the linear move or the drop, however you want to think about it. That's from here to here. That's phase 2. And then there's the rotation into landing. That's phase 3. 1, 2, 3. So we've covered the drift. We get into the hinge, and let's look at the position of the hip and the knee on the back leg during this. So you can tell he's wound and he's loaded into quite a bit of internal rotation on that back hip. So we know this because we can see this angle right here. The pelvis is rotated over top of the femur. So as he moves forward, he's actually in internal rotation on the back leg. You'll see guys that are in much less internal rotation or even slight external rotation potentially, who have maybe less hip mobility or really good external. You'll see this angle be a little bit different. You'll see it kind of look like that. That might be a guy like Justin Verlander, where you or Corey Kluber, you see kind of this vertical shin position where that shin is held vertical and it's more of a neutral or even slightly externally rotated position on the back hip. But again, Graterol does not do that. He very much takes advantage of what appears to be very high degrees of hip internal rotation mobility, and he's taking advantage of that in his forward move. Again, there's not a right or wrong way. Depending on your specific hip anatomy, you're going to have a specific position that elicits the best results. When we take a guy with good hip internal and we have him kind of test either internal rotation dominant or more of a vertical shin position, you can, within one session, figure out kind of what is the ideal position for that athlete's hip anatomy, hip structure that elicits the best results. So I have no doubt that this is that position for him. But just wanted to point out the position of that forward move. And I also want to point out the position of his pelvis and the angle of his pelvis as he moves forward. Lower level athletes, a lot of the times, they'll get this pelvis too tilted relative to the horizontal or the horizon. So he's got a little bit of tilt to the pelvis as he moves forward. But what you'll see with lower level athletes is as they move forward, they stay back too far and that pelvis starts to hike very uphill. Higher level guys, they keep that pelvis stacked underneath of them as they move forward. And so you typically won't see that pelvis hike more than about 10 to 15 degrees above the horizon. There might be a little bit of a hike, but it's never going to be what you'll see in lower level guys that stay back too far and drop into the backside and think that loading the pelvis is equivalent to basically like reaching and hiking with the front side. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, as we go into landing, the next thing I want to point out is elbow flexion angle. So at landing, what we're ideally looking for is the elbow is in line with the shoulders, and the elbow flexion angle, right, this angle between the forearm and the humerus, is roughly at 90 degrees. Now this doesn't have to be exactly at 90 degrees. This can be a little inside, it can be a little outside, but 90 degrees is kind of the standard. So he happens to be almost exactly at 90 degrees, is a good example of that principle that we constantly talk about as far as being able to get that ball directly in the plane of rotation. So good example here from Graterol. We can talk about the Paw Back Mechanism next. The Paw Back Mechanism is, we're talking about the lead leg. And what does the lead leg do at landing and after landing? So if we take a look at his lead leg at landing, he's in a good degree of knee flexion, right? He's not landing too deep and sinking too deep into his lead leg at landing. He's landing with a good angle there to be able to block against. But then what happens from this point on? So his pelvis is open, but it's not completely square to the target yet. You actually don't want to land with your hips completely square to the target. What hard throwers do is they land at the last second, the pelvis corkscrews open, the shoulders stay closed, and you might have 45, maybe 55 degrees of pelvic rotation. So his belt buckle is facing diagonally. He hasn't fully completed that pelvic rotation. Some pitchers might be a little more open, some might be a little more closed. But the point being, from this point on, he's got to complete that rotation. His front foot is landed, his pelvis is not squared up yet, and so as he rotates, the pelvis squares up with the target, and it's that squaring up of the pelvis that as this pelvis rotates this way, you can see the belt buckle squares up. let's think about what this side of the pelvis is doing. This side of the pelvis is rotating that way. This side is rotating this way. And so the pelvis completes its rotation, and that posterior rotation of the glove side of the pelvis actually pulls this femur, which pulls that knee into extension. So this knee is getting pulled into extension right there by the pelvis screwing backwards and completing its rotation. Not because he's extending the quad or doing, lateral hidings and trying to stick the landing and trying to train his reverse lunge strength or anything like that. It's happening because he's got efficient biomechanics. He's efficiently loading and unloading the pelvis. And as the pelvis completes its rotation, it pulls that front leg into extension. So hopefully that makes sense. From here, one other interesting thing that I do want to point out is his follow through. Now, we talk with our athletes about kind of what that follow through should look like, what a healthy follow through should look like. And what we're typically looking for is that arm doesn't just slam into the side of the body, that you actually get an unwinding effect of that throwing arm, where that forearm pronates, shoulder internally rotates, the scap protracts, the T-spine rotates glove side, and so you have a nice deceleration arc. We typically don't want to see a massive recoil like this, but it's one of these things that's still a little bit up for debate, whether it actually increases or decreases stress on the shoulder. You kind of have coaches in both camps, but it's just something that he does very, very drastically. Again, you can see he's basically slapping himself on the ribs right here. So pretty aggressive follow through. Interestingly enough, we have had an athlete who felt like he was kind of decelerating into ball release. He felt like he was taking his foot off the gas pedal a little bit. And we actually did see an increase in velocity when we cued slap yourself on the back. And so he was no longer decelerating into ball release, but he was thinking about accelerating through release. And so for him, that was actually a cue that helped his velocity. I'm not saying we need to all go and test that cue, but it just is interesting that for some guys, that can be an unlock from a velocity standpoint. So what could he potentially improve on? Now, he doesn't necessarily need to change anything. If he's having success, he's throwing 100. I'm not saying that, but if an athlete that moves exactly like him came to me and said, hey, I'm throwing 89, I need to throw 95, what can I do better mechanically? I just want to go through hypothetically what he could potentially do better if he were to throw harder. So the first thing is that there's a limited linear move. Now, ideally, what we want to see is that linear move lasts more than a couple frames. So we can look at this clip down here. Right, there's the drift aspect, there's the linear move. Ideally, you want to see that athlete ride the linear move longer than he does. He comes into the linear move and he kind of pops right out of it a little bit early. So ideally, you'd like to see him ride this position a hair longer as he's moving forward. He comes out of it just a hair early. Again, not necessarily a huge problem. I don't think it's costing him much, but we typically like to see guys, if they can hold that tension on the backside and ride it just a hair longer before they release the pelvis, that typically helps guys. The second thing is there's limited eversion in the back foot, and he's kind of popping off the back foot a little bit early. So if we slow this down, again, we're looking at the position of the back foot. We talked about this last week in the Sixto Sanchez breakdown, but ideally what you want to see is that back foot almost kind of rolls over into landing as the pelvis goes. You're maintaining contact with the back foot, the back ankle, and what happens as the pelvis goes is you get this kind of turning over or everting of this back foot, and then the heel comes off the ground and it rotates through. So he does kind of push a little bit and come out of that back foot a hair early. You don't see it evert and then come up. You just kind of see a little bit of a push and the foot just kind of rolls over, the heel comes up and over, versus everting and then coming up and over. It's a small thing. I don't think it's costing him much. But again, it's a little thing that we have seen have a pretty noticeable impact on certain athletes when they address that. If he was throwing like 92 all of a sudden, I would say maybe that's more important to address. But again, just something small that can play a big role for the right guy. And then interestingly enough, his arm is late sometimes. So certain throws, not this throw, if you go to landing, his arm is in a good spot, right? It's close to 90 degrees of external rotation. So he's in a pretty good spot there. But if we look at a different view of him, it seems like there's a little bit of mechanical, a little bit of a repeatability issue going on at times, unless this is, kind of his way of putting more movement on the ball. But on certain throws, this one in particular, we go to landing, and he's somewhere between here and there at landing. So, on good throws, he's actually fully up, or he's a little bit, a little ways away from being completely vertical. But on some of his throws, he does land quite late with that forearm. And so, again, that's something that I would tell maybe a lower level thrower, hey, there's some sort of lack of repeatability and consistency with the timing of that arm flip up. He's landing here sometimes, he's landing here other times. So maybe it's just a slight repeatability issue. But again, we do typically see when an athlete has a late arm like this, a lot of times, yes, it's not as efficient of a pattern, but if the arm is really late and they have violent rotation, a lot of times you will get this nasty sink, this nasty run on the pitch. And so, this particular throw, he did seem a little bit late, but what was the result? He still managed to throw it 100 and create 15 plus inches of horizontal movement. So again, not telling him he needs to change that, but just something to identify if you're working with a pitcher or you're trying to train yourself to throw harder. That's not necessarily the absolute most biomechanically efficient position to be in at landing, is the point. So I want to end it there. We could go through a ton of different things. When we break down pitchers, we take them through a 60-step process where we're looking at everything, from weight shift to rear glute to, ground contact on the back foot. Just an example of Graterol that we did. This is what we do with our athletes, with our mechanical assessments, with our mechanical analyses. Right now we do have a mechanical analysis sale going on, so definitely check out the link below if you haven't already. If you want to get yourself broken down. If you guys enjoyed this content, make sure to give the video a like, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to our channel. We're very passionate about educating people on efficient pitching mechanics and all things, baseball and velocity development. So if you found this information useful or you have any questions about the content, shoot us an email, leave a comment below, and we'll see you in the next video.